Hey, welcome and good evening. My name is Annette and I'm president of the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Before we start, I'm going to ask you to turn off your mic and your video camera. We are recording this presentation. If you have any questions, use chat at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So let me tell you a little bit about the Saratoga Historical Foundation. The mission of the Saratoga Historical Foundation is to preserve the rich history of Saratoga for the education and enjoyment of the community. We provide exhibits, research opportunities, lectures, as well as an 8-page newsletter on local history. Scholarship and essay contest, as well as pioneer living classes for young people are also available. Visit us at 20450 Saratoga Las Gatas Road and see the museum, which is in a 1904 building. We have an 1850 fully furnished pioneer cottage, a one-room schoolhouse, and very soon, a blacksmith exhibit. Today's presentation is co-sponsored by the Sunnyvale Heritage Park and Museum. The park is open Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday from noon to 4 p.m. The mission of the park is to educate the public and preserve the history of Sunnyvale and Silicon Valley. Go to their website to see more. This is part of a lecture series that started in January. And as you can see, we have other lectures coming up, including in August, we have Remembering the Flying Tigers, as well as in September, we have the history of the IOOF and the Saratoga Retirement Community, and more that will go until November. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. David has had an interesting life. He has traveled the world, including behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. He's been to South America at the age of 12 and even to a leper colony. David Mariani is the board chair. He earned his BA from the University of San Francisco with both undergraduate and postgraduate work at Santa Clara University. He served on 27 corporate boards. His service includes, but not limited to, private corporate boards, industry, agency boards, and public boards. He's written 2 books, and his professional career includes agribusiness, venture capital, real estate development, and private and public banking. Now, here's David.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I think I'm going to try to do some screen sharing, and I don't know if that worked or not. So are we all, is that working yet or not yet?
Not yet. You have not shared yet. There you go. You got it.
How about that? Okay. So when I did that, I lost that. Oh, I see where that is. So I've got to look at another screen, so I'm not really looking at you. Anyway, thank you everyone for your interest in my book, Poverty Affluence. It is a pleasure to make this presentation to you and look forward to questions at the end. The purpose of this presentation is to give you a little bit of an overview of what it's about. I'll add a few interesting stories to give you kind of a flavor for the book. It is written, it's a 4 generations account of Silicon Valley and how it developed from the Valley of Heart's Content to what it is today. It starts in 1882 and finishes in 2015. And the 4 generations of my great-grandfather, as told to us through a video that we were fortunate enough to video about an hour's worth of questions and answers with my aunts and my great-grandfather's grandchildren that had some really great stories. The other source, of course, is my grandfather. And I spent countless hours driving him around visiting his growers over in the wintertime. I'd hear one story after another. And then the third generation is my dad. And he wrote in 1978, between Christmas and New Year's, a book called My Life and My Dreams. Well, I didn't really write it. He dictated it during that period of time. It was still on tape. And right after he wrote it or dictated it, he went off to Australia on a business trip, and while he was there, he passed away from a heart attack. And I didn't realize it was actually on tape till sometime later, and it was a little spooky hearing his voice out of this little machine, but I had it transcribed and got it printed up as a little book. It was really just for the family. And my father, even though he was very well known for his all of his successes in business and philanthropy and other areas, the purpose of his book was he really thought that we would learn more from his failures than from his successes. And so his series of stories, there was a kind of a theme there, a life lesson that he was really written specifically for his immediate children. I embedded much of that book inside of my book, so that's part of one of the voices you'll hear as you read through the book. And it also inspired me to write my book and incorporate the four generations, the four voices throughout the book. And so a lot of people ask, well, what's with the title? What does that mean? Poverty of affluence. It seems a little bit of a contradiction. And it means different things depending upon the story. And so as you read through the history of our family, you'll be able to see that theme throughout the book. By the time my grandfather arrived in 1882, it was right after a very busy time in California. In 1848, the Mexican government owned California. They finally ceded it to the United States. And 6 months later, they find gold, and in today's dollars, $1 trillion worth of gold. A year later, we became a state. And within a decade, the Civil War occurred and closed and to a conclusion. And that was the kind of the backdrop of when my grandfather arrived in California in 1882. So it was a very busy time. But what brought most of the immigrants to California at the time was not the shiny metal of gold, but was the promise of land. And what brought them was really a push and a pull energy out of Europe, because Europe was really still stuck in a feudal system, patrimogenitors, that the oldest born male inherited the land and the property, and everyone else was serfs for the rest of their lives. And there was no possibility of owning land. And the whole idea of being able to buy land and actually own it was such a compelling pull into California. And there was these reports that you can just go to California and you can buy any land that you want. And they just couldn't believe that there was an environment that you could do this when you were stuck in a feudal system for centuries. And the push was the feudal system that was somewhat oppressive at the time. My grandfather's escaping the tyranny of the Austria-Hungary at the time, and so there was this dynamics of this promise of land that my grandfather had. Kind of a side story. He He said, every time I save $1, I buy an acre of land in Cupertino or Saratoga. And I said, well, why Cupertino, Saratoga? And he said, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's San Francisco, and the summer houses in Hillsboro, and you got San Jose, nothing in between. Nobody want land there. It's all in, nobody want Cupertino, Sunnyvale, Saratoga. No, it's gone. It's cheap land. And so I kind of laugh at it today, hearing him talk about, him buying another acre every time he saved $1. And he meant it literally. That was a literal reference of what he was doing in the 1910, 1905 era. So I'm trying to I'm not going to have just one. Here we go. Okay, so a little bit about the family history. We talked a little bit about the Italians coming over, but also the Croatians came through in waves. The English, of course, the Irish. Everyone thinks that we're Italian with a name like Mariani, but our name originally was Marjanović, which simply in Croatian means son of, similar to the traditions of England, where it'd be John, son of Jackson. If you were John, son of John, it would be Johnson, or you have Irish in Scotland. If you're Donald, you're McDonald's. Mec means son of. Johansson in the further north. The same type of a naming tradition. And Vic in Croatian means son of course. So we are Croatian. That's one of the things that will be a takeaway that a lot of people don't know. Another famous Croatian that our Italians in the crowd may take exception to, but is where did I lose my? How do I go to the next one? There we go. It's Marco Polo. Everyone thinks that Marco Polo is Italian because he sailed out of the Venetian flag, or with the Venetian flag. But he was born in Korčula, which is a little island off of Dubrovnik, and you can still go and visit his home even today. Interesting guy. The point of that is that the Croatians were known as farmers and fishermen, and from the fishing experience in the Adriatic, they're sailors. And during the Great Migration from Europe, the merchant ships were constantly running out of seamen, and they would tap Croatian crews to take their ships to and people to the New World. Unwittingly, they didn't know that if the merchant didn't have a backhaul, they couldn't afford to sail back and pay their wages. So they would just scuttle the boat there, and they would strand the Croatians on all the different ports of call in the United States. And it's for that reason why you'll see very high densities of Croatians in Long Beach and San Pedro, San Diego, around the Gulf Coast of Houston, Watsonville, San Francisco, of course, and up in Seattle. In fact, Watsonville at one time was called New Dalmatia because it was almost all Croatians at one time. As farmers, there were several European groups of vintners that settled in the valley, and they looked at the various microclimates and soil conditions, etc., and they concluded that Santa Clara Valley was the most ideal place to grow grapes. And they also discovered a very exciting new grape that they've never seen before that was indigenous to California. It was called the Concord grape. And what they didn't know is that there was a little tiny bug on that grape root system that's called phylloxera. In a lot of ways, phylloxera had a lot to do on the reason why Santa Clara Valley became so innovative in its culture. Seems kind of odd that a little bug would have that kind of influence, but hear me out. What happened is that the valley, Santa Clara, was planted out from end to end with vines as far as the eye could see. And they excitedly took these Concord grape and they sent it out back to Europe, and they planted it all over Europe to see what kind of climates would work best for this grape, not realizing it would make horrible wine, of course. And they didn't realize that they were exporting also the phylloxera that didn't exist in Europe. And then the European grape varieties had no resistance against it. And before long, all of the grapes in Europe were dying off, and all the grapes in Santa Clara Valley died off. Farmers in Santa Clara Valley didn't know what to do, so they started planting stone fruits of apricots, peaches, pears, cherries, etc. Just by the time those orchards started to bear fruit, they figured out the phylloxera problem, and the farmers had all their money tied up in their orchards now, and so they weren't going to bulldoze them to plant grapes, and so they stayed with the fruit orchards, and the vintners decided to go with the next best valley by the name of Napa. And that's really the tale of the two valleys on how Napa became known as the best, foremost wine growing area of the world, and Santa Clara Valley was known as the Valley of Heart's Delight and the premier fruit growing area in the world. Where at one time during blossom times, you thought it was snowing from all the blossoms coming down off of Stevens Creek. It was pretty amazing. Anyway, the difference between growing grapes and the fruit industry is the process of growing grapes and harvesting them and making wine hasn't changed for centuries, and it's pretty much the same today. Whereas in the fruit growing area world, we all had good fruit, where the differentiation with grapes was that, one grape, one vineyard, one winery made a better wine than another, and they built their reputation in that way. When all the fruit and all the prunes and all the apricots, they were all good, how do you compete? And the only way to compete was through competition. So we had in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara Valley, a hyper competition environment in the food processing world. I remembered as a kid that they would say that there was no way. Let me see. I'm kind of behind on some of my slides here. Here's my grandfather making barrels for when it was still grapes in the valley. But anyway, we had hyperinflation, hyper competition, and this kind of dried fruit plant. This is a view of our plant on Homestead and Highway 9. These kinds of little plants popped up all over the valley. There were hundreds of little dried fruit companies, and by 1955 they started to whittle out. There were 67 dried fruit companies in Northern California. And the only way to differentiate or to survive wasn't through a better wine or a better apricot, but was through innovation. And so there was this pressure to figure out how to process better, how to pick better. And I remember that they said, we'll never be able to replace hand picking prunes on the ground. And a couple of years later, there were prune picking machines. Here's a picture of them on the ground, and here's automatic harvesters of the prunes. The same story goes with boysenberries in the thicket. How do you pick boysenberries? You can't do it by machine. And 5 years later, they did that. Prune dehydrators were invented. Dipping plants were invented. They had automatic pitters, they had slicers. I mean, you name it. There was every kind of innovation on the world. So we had world-class engineers that came into this valley in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And one of the prominent companies at the time was a company called FMC. And a lot of people know FMC as the war machine engineering company for the military. But it's actually Foreign Machinery Corporation. And the military tapped this incredible talent in Silicon Valley that were focused on innovative solutions for the dried fruit industry and the fruit industry in general, and kind of retooled them for other purposes. But so by the time the high-tech industry started to develop in the valley, there was already this culture of innovation and engineering that pre-existed the silicon chip. By 1955, there were 67 dried fruit companies. By 1980, there were 6 because of this tremendous fallout of competition. Not gonna say it was a dog-eat-dog world, but there was high competition. Not everyone survived. There were some people who survived, some didn't. And what made the Mariani family and our companies survive the competition when others didn't? There were 3 big secrets that we revealed in the book, and I'll touch upon them just very briefly on why we survived and others didn't. One of them was that my grandfather had this unique talent of being able to estimate fruit right after the bloom, and when the fruit was still in the bud was still in the blossom, and he could go through an orchard that normally would produce a couple thousand pounds of fruit, maybe 10,000 pounds, and within 100 pounds, he would know how much was going to come off that tree or that orchard 5 and 6 months later. And people are scratching their head, how is he doing this? And he was really the first futures market, because he would come into an orchard and offer the farmer his crop that was nothing more than just a little tip of the finger on the tree, and give him a set price for the whole crop, and he would harvest it, pick it, and deliver it to the packing house. The farmer would always take the bird in hand and the safe way out. But my grandfather knew exactly how much was going to come off of that orchard, and that also helped us in managing our inventory, because we knew if there was going to be short crops 6 months before everyone else did, or if there was going to be a bumper crop 6 months before people did. And speaking of inventory, the dried fruit industry is the world's worst inventory turn business, because you need a lot of people. You turn tables in a restaurant every couple hours, or you turn your inventory on your retail shelves every couple of weeks or every month. For us, it was you turn your inventory every 16 months, because the only time you can get your inventory is during high season, like apricots in June. And then you had to carry that product in the stores the entire year, come around to new crop, and then you had to process it, sort it, etc. It takes a couple months after the new crop, after the season's over, to be able to deliver to the stores. So it's just, 15, 16 months. And so it had a huge inventory problem, and it always has been. It's the nature of the beast of this particular industry. And it's very expensive to carry that kind of fruit inventory throughout the year, from your storage costs, insurance costs, cost of your money. And so if you have a $3 product and it costs you 1% a year, or 1% a month to carry it, it's about 30 cents. And if you're dealing with, tens of millions of pounds of each kind of crop, it adds up very, very quickly. So my father had reasoned that if you source your fruit from the southern hemisphere as well as the northern hemisphere, you only needed half as much inventory carry. And so we had the advantage of, we could have the same amount of sales, same amount of throughput, et cetera, with half as much inventory carry. And so if you're saving, let's say 15 cents on 100 million pounds, that's a huge advantage over our competition. That's one of the reasons why we're able to survive, was for that simple insight that my father had. Interesting thing is that not one of our competitors copied our model. And we've been doing it since the 1950s. And why? I kind of scratched my head today, why no one has really copied that model. Speaking of the Southern Hemisphere, we started out in South America, in Argentina and Chile, specifically in Mendoza and a couple valleys in west of Santiago. And we never had vacations in the summer, because that was game time, that was harvest time. We're working 7 days a week and long hours. And so in the winter times, my parents would alternate and take one of the kids with them on a business trip to be able to give us, that was kind of our vacation. It was my turn on one of the trips down to South America when I was 12 years old, and went to Rio and then Buenos Aires. And the day we're leaving Buenos Aires, I asked my dad, why is there machine guns on every street corner? He goes, oh, they're having elections tomorrow, and revolutions is their national sport. Then we were off to Chile, and there was a big problem in Chile at the time. The socialist government and the pre-Allende's days were coming, and they were nationalizing a lot of the farms, and they passed a rule that you couldn't export your money on the sale of a farm unless you were a resident of the country. And so I'm listening to this very serious conversation over dinner with attorneys and advisors, and as a 12-year-old, and I said, well, Dad, since the farms are in the children's trust, why don't I just go to school? I'll stay behind and I'll go to school here for the next year while you sell your land. And this chatter that was going on at the dinner at the time, everyone kind of stopped and they kind of looked at each other, and they said, the lawyer said, well, that would work. And my mother was horrified. She said, well, honey, you don't want to stay behind, you're 12 years old. Do you really? And I said, didn't really realize what I was saying at the time. And I said, yeah, I do. And I'll stay behind. And so within like 72 hours, they got me enrolled in San Jorge Colegio. I got in, they made an arrangement for me to stay with a local family, and off they went. And had no idea how long it was going to be before I saw my family again. There was not without drama. The all of the power in Santiago, the moment I was about to take off on the airplane back home on a Pan Am flight, because of a huge snowstorm that was very wet, and it normally doesn't snow in Santiago. And all the runways and everything shut down, and so the plane could not take off because it was shut down. But as far as the United States was concerned, the plane had permission to take off, and it was officially lost. It was a lost airplane. So my parents thought for 3 or 4 days that they had lost me. So I had I had no idea that all this drama was going on by the time I arrived and got through customs. But I had a lot warmer reception than I was expecting at the time. I had to grow up pretty fast. As I soon went into high school and boarding school, and then off to the seminary. And I kind of look back at those 12 years old, and I really didn't live at home very much longer after that. It was, like I said, I had to grow up quickly. My father was an eccentric in many ways. He thought outside the box, and some of his ideas were great ideas, and some of them were not so great. But a kind of a known phenomena when it rains, when cherries are almost fully ripe, the water will get absorbed by the cherry and split the apricot, the cherry, and make them unsaleable. And it was one day, right at the wrong time with cherries, it started to rain, and my dad reasoned, well, I got to get this water off of the cherries. And so he called up the Army, called up Heller helicopter, and he got all these helicopters, an armada of them, and showed him on a map. You can kind of see him showing, what orchards were his. And they had these helicopters hovering over all of our cherry orchards in the valley. And people were coming out and saying, this is crazy, what is going on? Anyway, the darn thing worked. It shook off all the excess water. We were the only ones with cherries that weren't split and available to the market. It was a huge commercial success. And as a kind of a side anecdote, that is the standard of the industry today. When it rains at the wrong time, is to send helicopters over orchards and just hover over those orchards. At the time, it was how he organized something within 24 hours and called people, and they called him back, and he was a force of nature. He was that kind of magnetic personality to make that happen. It was pretty amazing, that story. If I had time to go in more detail, I would. But some of his better known failures is we had a ranch up in Ripon, California, and it had some low land there, and next door was a Nestle's coffee plant, and they had excess coffee grounds they couldn't dump anywhere they were shut off at the commercial dumps. And so my dad made a deal with them for 10 years. They could dump it on this lowland property that we had in Ripon. And he said, if they're paying us for the material, I'll figure out a use for it. And one solution after the other didn't pan out until by that time, just a way of background, we shifted all of our operations from Chile to Australia. And while he was in Australia, he learned about these giant earthworms. And he reasoned that if you brought these giant earthworms in, they could eat up all the coffee grounds, and they leave castings, earthworm castings, are sold by the ounce. And he thought it would be, perfect solution for his coffee grounds. And so I tell the story in the book, and an early editor, he said, no, you can't have a story like that unless you have pictures, because no one's going to believe the giant earthworm story. So it took a while for me to find the earthworm. You can see the size of these earthworms. But what the problem was is that these earthworms lived and thrived in an area of Australia that had a very specific pH. And when you take it out of that environment, they died. And so they didn't survive in Ripon. And the coffee grounds was, we never really found a use for the coffee grounds until we had a huge storm, and the banks of the American River overflowed, picked up a wall 30 feet high of coffee grounds, and took it out to sea. And that was our final solution of the coffee grounds. In Cupertino was very much of a rural environment in the 50s. This is a picture of the general store at Highway, excuse me, Highway 9 and Stevens Creek. It has, I remember it to have a wooden sidewalk, just like you would think of in the Old West. Here's a on the right side an aerial of the crossroads at Stevens Creek and Highway 9. Highway 9 was the only route to Santa Cruz at the time. And you can kind of see the orchards mixed in with a few buildings here and there. But it wasn't that long ago that it was very much of a rural area and not the high-tech environment that we know today. Another story that I tell is about Pal the babysitter, and we had horses, of course, ourselves. And Pal was known as the only horse to be showcased on Western Horseman on the cover of the magazine twice. And the first was as Pal the babysitter, that had stories of us shimmying up his legs and her legs and climbing on, and all sorts of tales about this horse that was this brilliant horse. It could open up just about any gate, etc. And the other story was a story of tragedy. My parents were in Europe at the time, and Pal had got pushed into a stump in one of the pastures and broke its leg. And as you know, what most people do with broken legs is that they shoot the horse. But Pal was, she was our buddy. You know, it was like a member of the family. We couldn't imagine the horse, you know, shooting the horse. And we were all crying, and the vet goes, well, there's really nothing we can do. We're going to have to shoot her. So why not set the leg like you do any you know, other animals or other people? And so we talked him into, you know, setting her leg, and we rigged up a harness for her in the barn and hung her up, you know, so she's suspended off the ground. And the darn thing worked. And but unfortunately, Pal was too smart for her own good and figured out how to get out of the harness and flipped. And as she did so, she shattered her broken leg into many pieces. And the vet said, there's no way that we can reset this leg, and we're gonna have to put her down. And we cried and cried. He says, well, no, well, why not just cut the leg off? And he says, no, you can't do that. And I don't know, can you see this picture right here? With it being cut off. I'm gonna see this. I think you can see that now, huh? So anyway, here's a picture of us during the operation of PAL. And here's a picture of her with with one of her legs missing. PAL did very well afterwards, surprising. She lived about 15 years after she lost her leg, and it remained a dear friend of the family and one of our horses. So that was. Are we? So again, I'm just taking little highlights of the book of us growing up. As this is me as a youngster at the time. So I went off to the seminary, and while I was there, I ran into a missionary that was working with lepers on the island of Bali. And Bali at the time had the highest instances of leprosy. And he was, the spirits were down because they had no way of really treating the lepers. And as we started to talk, I said, well, why not just get a clinic together, and we'll get some doctors and medicine and make that all happen. I said, well, it's a lot easier said than done. And I kind of took that as a challenge, and I went down to Australia, we had some nice contacts down there, got the 2 pharmaceuticals to supply medicines that were too old to go into the retail distribution channels, but were still good enough. They're still good medicines, they're in good shape. And to go into the clinic that I hadn't built yet, but it was going to that clinic that I used to refer to it as. And I convinced 24 doctors to donate their vacation time of 1 month every other year to man the clinic that didn't exist yet in Bali. Then raced over to Bali and spent a better part of 6 months putting together a clinic there, put all the facilities together and so forth. And so after an exhausting period of time, but I got it all done, except I was a little bit short at the end. I was about $6,000 short of finishing up the clinic the way I wanted it to be done. And so I called my dad up and I said, Dad, I'm $6,000 short, and this is what needs to get done. And he said no. And I was surprised, because I thought for sure that he would donate or lend the money or do something. And he said no. And so here's me working with some of a leper at the time. We got the clinic put together, bubble gummed it together in a way that it wasn't the way I wanted it, but it worked. I worked my way home about a few months later. I did a very mature thing of giving my dad the silent treatment. And he called me up one day and he says, don't you want to know why I turned you down? And I says, no, I really do want to hear that. And so I went to his house and we sat down, and he said, son, I was watching what you've done with this clinic down in Indonesia. And if you put that same talent and effort into business, you can afford to finance 77 clinics. And so that was the beginning of a career choice and change for me, where I went from studying to be a priest to working in business. I went back to Santa Clara. I got my MBA there and started working in the family business. I started out in the agribusiness, and it was a perpetual summer of harvesting from California for 6 months, and I just end up in Australia for 6 months and back. It was a crazy time. But on one of the moments when I was home, I got a call from this guy, Dave, that had just bought an apricot orchard in the hills and needed it to be disked. And I said, well, we really don't do that. But I have one of our local growers that might want to do it. So I called a guy by the name of Pete Camarda, and Pete said, yeah, I'll do it for $650. So we went up there to the apricot orchard, sat down with old Dave, and he plowed the orchard and came in and says, well, it wasn't as steep as I thought it was going to be, so it's only $450. And Dave was completely flabbergasted that he was charging us less than what we quoted him. Anyway, we became good friends, and he started telling me about technology and computer chips, and I had all sorts of questions because the valley was changing so quickly. And anyway, the guy that I knew was this fella, Dave Packard, sitting in his shed talking about the valley. And this is the valley, this is the Packard that most people knew. He was quite an interesting soul and very kind and generous with his time. But it was right about that time my dad came to me and he said, son, I think it's time to stop raising trees and cultivating the soil, and it's time to start raising buildings and cultivating plants. And so I picked Dave's Packard's mind a little bit of this whole area of technology and what companies are going to be successful and why and who isn't. And it was on and about that time, there was this fellow by the name of Steve Jobs that came and approached me with this business plan. And it was, to be honest, that the only word that I can come up with is horrid. It was just abominable. And I said, hey, Steve, you need to talk to someone that has a little more expertise in a business plan. You may have some good technology ideas, but so make a long story short, Steve and a fellow by the name of Michael Marcola were put together, and Michael helped put together the business plan and put the seed money into Apple. And he's kind of been behind the scenes kind of guy, wonderful person. His wife, Linda, is fabulous. And he's been on the board from the very beginning. He's not a household name. I think he may be one of the largest shareholders, if not the largest shareholder in Apple today. Very, like I say, runs in the weeds, really quiet spoken, wonderful man. But anyway, we built our first building in Cupertino for Steve. And about a month before we were about ready to put him to take possession, he came to me and says, our R&D has cost us a lot more than we thought, and we're running a little bit behind, a little bit short, and we want to, how about giving us 6 months free rent, and I'll give you Apple shares at 5 cents a share. And I saw him over the last 6 months and how he dealt with people, and I said, this guy will never be successful. And I turned him down and says, no, we would want our rent money. And that one decision has talked about good decisions, bad decisions. That one had a B in front of it, how much we lost by not taking him up on his proposal. But those are the kinds of things you have to look back at and laugh a little bit. I look back and I see Steve as, the executive of the millennium, and I couldn't figure out what I'd missed, because I'm a pretty good judge of character, and how he could be the executive of the millennium. And it was really rough on his people. That's the thing that boggled my mind. And I don't think I've ever seen it written anywhere, but in my opinion, with my experience with him, I'm convinced that he was on, if he didn't have Asperger's, he was on the cusp. because he'd fixate on things, and in particular when it came to a product, he was so focused on that product, on being exactly perfect. So it was just unbelievable how fixed he was on making the product really perfect. And I think as his perfectionist as a product developer, made the product Apple known as a good product that people bought. And I think that's why the company was successful, was because of his determination to make his products as good as they were, not necessarily on how he managed his people. So I missed that one. And in looking in hindsight, if it was faced the same set of circumstances, I probably would have made the same decisions. But anyway, you have to. I kind of laugh at how I missed that one. I don't know if I have time for the Homebrew Club stories in Wozniak and developed in the Lisa. Let's see how much time. I think we're running short. I think I'll skip the Bill Gates story and Wozniak story. You know, when I was getting close to finishing the book, I started thinking about my life a little bit, as you tend to kind of reminisce. And a couple things struck me. And the word relevance came to mind. And because successes and failures come with all businesses, and ours was no exception. As I got older, money meant very little to me, and relevance, I discovered, was the key element, central element for human contentment. I was asked a series of questions once. Name the 5 wealthiest people in the world. I had no idea. Or name the last 5 Heisman Trophy winners, and I watch college football all the time. The last 5 Miss America contest winners. Who are the last half a dozen Nobel Prize winners? And who won the Academy Awards in the last 5 years? I don't know. Who won the series, 3 years ago, the World Series? Well, I didn't do so well. I couldn't remember the headliners of yesterday. These aren't second-rate achievers. They were the best in their field. But when the applause dies and the awards tarnish, achievements are forgotten, and accolades are buried with their owners. Then I was asked a series of interesting questions. List a few teachers that made a difference in your life, or a person that helped you during some difficult times, or a few people that taught you something that was really worthwhile, or someone that just simply made you feel appreciated, and of course people you enjoyed spending time together, or a few heroes that have inspired you. The people who make a difference in our lives are not the ones that with the most credentials. They're the ones who care. If you want to stay relevant, then care for other people. So those are my kind of parting thoughts. And after writing the book and thinking about my life story, I didn't touch upon a lot of the stories, obviously, because I didn't have the time to do so. But that's pretty much on my closing comments at the moment, and available for questions.
Yeah, I saw one question come by earlier. As a family who's been involved internationally in fruit, can you share what you are now doing on bee research? Bee as in the pollinator.
Oh, I've been doing some talks on bees for the last year. I've been working with Chico State on developing a different way of managing the honeybees. And one of the reasons is that we've been managing the honeybees the same way as we did in the pre-industrial revolution. It was developed, the stacked super system was developed by a monk by the name of Langstrup in 1706. And we've been doing it exactly the same way ever since. And I have an ulterior motive in developing a better bee system, is to help the beekeepers stay in business in the United States. And the reason is that we've been losing our honeybees at a rate of 40% a year. And if you do your math, it only takes a year, 2.5 years to lose all of our pollinators. And 2 out of 5 mouthfuls of food that you had today is because of the honeybee, and we wouldn't have it. And what I quote Albert Einstein in my bee talks, that if we lose the honeybee, mankind has 4 years to live before we become extinct. Because without the honeybee, you have no plants. You have no plants, you have no animals. You have no animals, you have no humans. So the honeybee is a very important little bugger, and anything we can do to keep the beekeepers in business, because they're the ones that are propagating and replacing the massive die-off that's occurring in the bee industry today, and it's been going on for a couple of decades, and it's really a serious problem. And I've decided during my retirement to tackle the issue, and I have a whole talk that's on it and what we're doing. But I don't know if that's specifically answers the question, but that's what I'm involved in at the moment.
Okay. Annette, can you unmute yourself now? Apparently not.
Can you hear me?
There you go.
Yay! You did have a question about buying your book, which is really quite fabulous, and I have a copy. So I hope everybody gets a copy. I think, can't they buy it from your website?
Yes. Yeah, they can.
Do you want to give your website?
The website is www.griffinpress.net.
Perfect. And do you still have time to talk about the Homebrew Club? It was such a neat story.
Well, a friend of mine, Don Pizzolo, was an engineer and was part of the Homebrew Club, and it's really kind of a legendary early pre-Silicon Valley almost. Not really, but it was right at the early years. And you have these luminaries today that were just young kids like me at the time, collaborating with each other. It was Gates and Wozniak and Jobs, and I mean, it's, all the guys that were the early guys in the business. I see Wozniak. He's had this funky little keyboard and a little machine. He's tapping away during the whole meeting, and I didn't know who he was at the time. It was the first meeting I went to. And what he was doing is he was typing in the operating system program for the Lisa, and he was typing madly so he could demonstrate the operating system to the group. And the crazy thing is, and I laugh about it, is anyone that's done programming, all you need is one keystroke mistake, and you've got a bug, and the whole thing crashes, right? And he's going to went like this, like crazy, and then he demonstrates the whole thing, and he has no memory in his little contraption. And so when he turns it off, the whole thing goes poof, it's gone. The whole thing is in his head. And to this day, I'm just still in amazement on what a brilliant guy. He's so humble and down to earth, but they ought to dissect his brains someday and look at it, because it's a really an unusual brain. It's astonishing what he was able to do.
So I see one more question. And the question is, have you ventured into developing vineyards?
Say it again, please.
Have you developed any vineyards?
Well, we did. We've grown grapes going back in the 17th century. Vin Mariani was wine that was produced for Pope Leo. So our family goes way back in the wine making business. We grew a lot of grapes at the Sonoma, still do, and in Lake County. I own a vineyard in Saratoga. It was the old Congress Springs vineyards that we purchased and improved. It is now, we sold it to some folks, and I'm trying to think of the name of it today. It's Chanel.
It's Savannah Chanel.
Yeah, Ivana, yeah, that's right, Chanel. Try it. Thank you for helping me out on that one.
Are there any more questions? Gail Hugger.
Thank you. Hi, David. I've read your book twice.
Uh-oh.
I read the hardback copy.
Oh, okay.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And this is the second time I've heard you speak. So I have a B question. In the procedures that you are researching and working on to help beekeepers and bees around the world, how does it work when you have third world countries that have a need to spray or treat their crops because of pests and everything, and those pesticides are affecting bee populations? How do you see that going forward with, like, it seems like a contradiction in practices?
Well, modern horticultural practices are very, very hard on bees, as you are alluding to, whether it's in third world countries or in modern agriculture, let's say in California. In the third world countries, there's an advantage over the high-tech farming that you see in, I'm going to say specifically California, because California is notorious for monocropping, and that is, you'll have 1,000 acres of almonds, and you have 500 acres of melons, and you have 300 acres of cucumbers, and it's these single crops. And the problem with that, I'll give the highlight of almonds with the bees, that there's now 1.8 million acres of almonds in California, and there's 2.6 million hives shipped on, it is such a perversion, are shipped on semis from all over the United States that come in for an 11-day period that's called the almond blossom period. And if you don't bring the bees in, you get 0 almonds. And so the bees have plenty to feed on and to nourish their colony for 11 days. And then on that 12th day, they begin to starve because there's no more food. They don't have any companion plantings down the road or anything, because it looks beautiful from the air. You've got all this perfectly there's orchards and everything's perfectly clean. There's not a weed in sight. But there's nothing for them to live on. And so in these third world countries, they have little, you know, a quarter acre of this and a half acre of this and a tenth of an acre of that. They have companion plantings. There are plenty of other fauna around for the bees to make a living. Whereas in California, the bees will starve to death unless you move most of them out of state.
So what happens? So after you bring in these 2 million hives, then where do they take them next?
They've got to immediately move them to other places where there's nectar flow. And they go to, a lot of them go from there to pollinating, you know, the berries and the cucumbers and, you know, the various crops in California. Then they move them back out and back east again, where they have they have areas where the bees can actually survive and live. So it's a very tortured problem that if you have one case of foul brew in Cincinnati and they bring all the hives into California into one spot, it's like having one person with COVID and everyone jamming together at a football game. You're going to have a lot of people in that football stadium with COVID afterwards. Well, that's the same thing that's happening with bees. You have one hive in Cincinnati can infect, you know, 100,000 hives, and so you're creating this. You know, it's kind of the perfect storm of disease and stress on the bees and lack of food because of the monocropping. And the varroa mite that came from China that we're not sure how it got here, but it's been devastating the industry.
I did not realize this, so this is really interesting to me.
It's and the biggest problem is that I don't want to really start grandstanding here, but the problem is a lot more serious than people think, because the beekeepers need about $2 a pound minimum on their raw honey in order for them to break even. And we've had dumping from other countries of honey into the United States, driving the price down to under $1. And so the beekeepers are going broke. I mean, by the thousands because of this dumping. And that is now well known and very, very well documented that about 70% of our honey is imported into the United States now, and about 80% of that honey is fake, and it comes from China. And it's fake honey that's been dumping into the United States at the same time the varroa mite was introduced into the United States, and it's destroying the beekeepers of the United States. And you know, it's hard for us as Americans to think that we can't feed ourselves. But if we lose our beekeepers and lose our bees, we literally cannot feed ourselves. So it's a giant problem. So I didn't mean to kind of get into it because it's a whole nother talk that I give. But thank you for bringing it up.
Well, I used to keep bees, but all of my hives died in 1 year.
I'm not surprised. It's probably because of the varroa mite.
Yeah.
It's most likely.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we've had people come and speak at another organization from the Santa Clara Valley Bee Guild, and they're just wonderful.
Oh, great. I'd like to learn more about that, maybe offline.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, David, it was just really a fabulous presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I enjoyed it thoroughly, and your book is just wonderful. It has so many interesting details about your life.
Well, thank you. As you know, after reading it, I can't really get into a lot of the detailed stories, but I'm glad you enjoyed the read, and thank you everyone for the interest in the book.
Wonderful. So I hope we'll see you again. We have other presentations planned, and I do encourage you to buy David's book. It really is quite fabulous. So thank you for coming.
You bet. Bye-bye.